It was a cold evening in late November 2006 when 22-year-old university student Emily Hart walked briskly down Maple Avenue toward the bus stop. She had just finished her final class of the day, and like most nights, she planned to take the 8:30 bus back to her small off-campus apartment. The air carried that heavy stillness only found on suburban streets after dark. Streetlights flickered, patches of fog drifted low, and the stop itself sat beneath a single humming bulb. Emily was tired, but calm. At 8:38 p.m., she sent a quick text to her roommate. "On my way. The bus is late. Weird." What seemed like an ordinary delay would soon become the last trace of her ever being seen alive. Witnesses later told police they noticed a young woman standing alone, shifting her weight anxiously as minutes passed and no bus arrived. One commuter described her pacing, glancing at her phone, occasionally stepping into the street to check for headlights. Another claimed they saw her glance over her shoulder more than once, as if uneasy about someone nearby. The details were inconsistent, but the impression was clear. Emily had been waiting, she had been growing nervous, and then, sometime after 8:45, she was gone. Emily wasn't the type of person who simply disappeared. Friends described her as reliable, grounded, and sometimes cautious to a fault. A psychology major with aspirations to become a counselor, she had a close relationship with her family and a routine life that rarely strayed outside predictable boundaries. She didn't drink heavily, didn't party much, and she never failed to check in with her roommate. For her not to come home that night was immediately unusual. By morning, her empty bed, unanswered calls, and unread texts would send alarms rippling through her circle. Her roommate, Sarah, woke to find Emily's shoes by the door, her bag of textbooks still neatly stacked at the desk, and her phone mailbox filled with unanswered calls. By 10 a.m., Sarah phoned Emily's parents, who lived 2 hours away. They were certain something was wrong. By noon, her father was on the highway headed to campus, and by evening, after Emily missed an important study session and still had not surfaced, her family contacted the police. At first, the response was careful but measured. College-age disappearances were common enough, and many resolved within hours. A detective asked if Emily had been stressed, if she had ever hinted at wanting to leave, or if she might have gone to visit a boyfriend. Sarah insisted. Emily was steady, predictable, and had been making plans for the week ahead. She had exams, a part-time shift at the bookstore, and a trip home for Thanksgiving already marked on her calendar. She wouldn't have walked away. When officers canvassed the bus stop, they found little more than cigarette butts, tire marks, and scraps of litter that could have belonged to anyone. The bus driver scheduled to pass through that stop confirmed he had been running a different route that night. Service delays had been common, and a missed pickup wouldn't have seemed unusual at the time. But in hindsight, it meant Emily had been standing there longer than expected, alone, in the dark, vulnerable. One witness came forward saying they remembered a dark sedan slowing near the stop around the time Emily vanished. The details were hazy. No license plate, no clear description of the driver, just the vague image of headlights pausing, then rolling on. Another resident claimed they heard a woman's raised voice around 9 p.m., but when they looked out their window, the street was empty. Leads like these were fragile, and without physical evidence, they were impossible to verify. By the second day, Emily's absence was front-page news in the local paper. Reporters photographed her parents clutching missing person flyers, their faces pale with worry. Her father pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Her mother's voice broke as she insisted, "Emily would not do this. Someone knows something." The police widened their search. Officers walked the wooded paths that ran behind the bus stop, flashlights sweeping through brambles and shallow creeks. K-9 units were brought in to trace her scent, but the dogs lost the trail within yards of the curb where she'd last been seen. It was as if she had stepped off the sidewalk and vanished into the night. The bus stop itself became a symbol of dread for the community. Students began avoiding it after dark, walking in groups or arranging rides instead. The city quietly installed brighter lights and a surveillance camera weeks later, but for Emily, it was too late. What remained was a haunting silence. No calls from her phone, no activity on her bank account, no sightings by friends or neighbors. Just the memory of a young woman standing beneath a flickering light, waiting for a bus that never came, and the chilling question of what happened in the minutes that followed. It was in those missing minutes, between her last message and the silence that followed, that the course of Emily Hart's life was rewritten. And those minutes would soon become the obsession of investigators, reporters, and her family for the next 19 years. Detectives began piecing together the fragments of Emily Hart's final night almost immediately. Their first step was to retrace her movements, starting at the university campus. Surveillance footage from a library camera captured her walking out at 8:15 p.m., carrying her bag, glancing at her phone, and heading toward the main street. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or urgency. She didn't appear to be meeting anyone, and she wasn't in a rush. She was simply heading home, the way she had dozens of times before. From there, police relied on witness accounts. A barista from a cafe just 2 blocks from the stop remembered Emily coming in shortly before closing. She bought a small coffee, to go, exact change from her pocket, and thanked him quietly before stepping back into the night. That simple purchase provided a small anchor in the timeline. It meant Emily had left campus, stopped briefly at the cafe, and reached the bus stop by 8:30. Her phone records narrowed the picture further. At 8:41, she sent the last text to her roommate. "Bus is late." Weird detectives considered the wording. Nothing in it suggested panic, but the casual tone hid the fact that this would be her last known communication. Investigators cross-referenced cell tower data, confirming that her phone had pinged off a tower near the intersection where the stop stood. After that, the phone went silent. No calls, no texts, no location updates. Police canvassed the surrounding blocks, going door to door. Some residents had been watching television, others were already asleep. A few recalled seeing a young woman under the streetlight, scrolling on her phone. One man remembered her stepping into the road to look for approaching headlights. Another swore he saw a car pull up near the curb, idling for a moment before moving on. Descriptions of the vehicle were vague, dark-colored, possibly a sedan, no clear make or license plate. Still, it was a lead, and detectives seized on it. Investigators checked nearby security cameras, hoping one might have captured the car in more detail. A liquor store camera half a block away did catch headlights approaching, but the footage was grainy, the frame rate poor. All that could be seen was a blurred shape, a dark outline of a car slowing near the bus stop, then pulling away. Whether Emily got inside or was forced inside was impossible to tell. But the timing matched the moment her phone went dead. The lack of clarity was crushing. A blurred vehicle was not evidence, but it was the closest thing to a direction the case had. Detectives sent stills from the footage to local stations and released a plea to the public. If anyone recognized the vehicle, they needed to come forward. No one did. Meanwhile, the search grew urgent. Officers scoured wooded areas behind the bus route, drainage ditches, and empty lots where someone could have taken her. Helicopters swept overhead with infrared, while search dogs worked on the ground. But the trail ended abruptly near the stop. It was as if she had been plucked from the street and vanished into the night. The first 24 hours passed with no progress. By the second day, frustration was mounting. Detectives interviewed Emily's professors, classmates, and friends. They asked about boyfriends, stalkers, troubled acquaintances, anyone who might have reason to harm her. Everyone painted the same portrait: a young woman with steady grades, a small circle of close friends, and no enemies. The only irregularity was a short-lived relationship with an ex-boyfriend months earlier, which had ended on tense terms. Detectives noted his name but couldn't prove a connection to her. Disappearance. By the third day, the urgency sharpened. Statistics weighed heavily on the investigation. Detectives knew that the chances of recovering a missing adult alive dropped steeply after 72 hours. Emily's parents, now staying in town, were desperate, pleading with authorities to treat the case as an abduction. They insisted she would not have left willingly, not with exams days away, not with family waiting for her at Thanksgiving. Under growing pressure, The department shifted its approach. What had begun as a missing person case was reclassified as a likely abduction. That change meant more resources, more agents, and the involvement of federal databases. The blurred sedan was now considered a vehicle of interest, and the last 20 minutes of Emily's life, from her cafe purchase to her final text, became the focus of a painstaking reconstruction. Detectives sat with the timeline over and over, looking for the gap. At 8:15, she left the library. At 8:25, she bought coffee. At 8:30, she reached the bus stop. At 8:41, she texted her roommate. At 8:45, she vanished. The space between those numbers, so small on paper, was the void that swallowed her whole. It was this void, this missing stretch of minutes, that haunted investigators most. For if they could not fill those minutes, they could not find her. And as the third night fell, with no sightings, no phone activity, and only the faint shadow of a car, the case was about to shift from anxious waiting into something far darker. In the days following Emily Hart's disappearance, the town of Brookdale became the center of a desperate search. Local authorities coordinated with volunteers, mapping out wooded trails, riverbanks, and abandoned properties where someone could have hidden a body or a frightened young woman. By sunrise on the fourth day, more than 100 people gathered at the community center, signing their names on clipboards and dividing into search teams. They carried flashlights, orange vests, and the grim determination that comes when a neighbor's child vanishes without explanation. Police K-9 units swept the perimeter of the bus stop again, expanding outward in concentric circles. The dogs sniffed discarded clothing, items from Emily's apartment, and the shoes she had worn the previous day, but they failed to pick up a strong trail. Officers noted that scent detection often faltered in cold, damp weather, and November nights in Brookdale dropped into the low 30s. The conditions were against them. After hours of circling, the animals came back empty, their handlers shaking their heads with frustration. Attention soon turned to the river that snaked along the edge of town. Searchers waded through waist-deep water, dragging rakes across the muddy bottom while divers combed deeper sections. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting through the murk. Nothing surfaced, no clothing, no bag, no body. The river gave up no secrets. Vacant. Buildings on the outskirts were entered and cleared, each echoing with the heavy boots of search parties calling her name into silence. At one abandoned rail depot, volunteers discovered graffiti and old mattresses, evidence of squatters, but no trace of Emily. Every empty house, every shed, every drainage ditch became a potential hiding place, yet each one closed without results, leaving behind only the growing weight of futility. As days stretched into a week, the search expanded to nearby counties. Flyers bearing Emily's photo, her bright smile, straight brown hair, and clear eyes, were stapled to telephone poles and taped inside shop windows. Local news anchors reported daily from the bus stop, describing it as the last known place she was seen alive. The pressure on police mounted with each passing hour. And still, nothing was found. With no evidence and no body, speculation began to seep into the community. Whispers spread that maybe Emily had left by choice. Perhaps the stress of school or personal struggles hidden from even her closest friends had driven her to walk away. Others insisted there had been a man, someone older who had been watching her. Rumors of a stalker circulated, unconfirmed but difficult to ignore. Each version of events twisted her story into something different, blurring truth and gossip until no one knew which to believe. For investigators, the lack of progress forced them to entertain uncomfortable possibilities. One theory suggested she might have staged her disappearance, seeking escape from pressures unknown. Detectives brought this up gently with her parents, but they dismissed it outright. Emily was not the kind of person to vanish without a word. She had a family who loved her, a future she had been working toward, and a routine she followed without deviation. To them, the idea she had simply walked away was insulting. Her mother kept repeating the same phrase to reporters, "She would not do this." Someone took her. Her father's anger grew sharper by the day, directed at police who seemed unable to find answers. Press conferences grew tense, reporters demanding to know if the department had any suspects. Officers admitted they were working several leads but refused to share details. Behind the scenes, the investigation was already losing momentum. As winter settled in, the search grew harder. Snow fell in early December, covering trails and fields, erasing any trace that might have remained. Footprints, discarded objects, and subtle signs of struggle were buried under ice. Volunteers dwindled. Fewer people showed up for organized searches as the weeks dragged on, and the bitter cold made each effort more punishing. For Emily's family, each day without progress deepened the hollow ache of uncertainty. Candlelight vigils were held near the bus stop, crowds gathering with photos and prayers. Neighbors lit candles in their windows, a gesture of solidarity for the hearts. But as the holiday season arrived, the contrast between celebration and absence became unbearable. For Emily's parents, the joy of Christmas lights strung across their neighborhood only amplified the emptiness inside their own home. Her gifts sat unopened beneath the tree. Her chair at the dinner table remained vacant. Detectives, meanwhile, found themselves cycling through the same evidence with no new developments. They had a few names on their radar: the ex-boyfriend, a professor she had been close to, the shadowy driver of the sedan. But without physical evidence or a confession, there was nowhere to go. Each suspect denied involvement. Each alibi, though imperfect, was sufficient to avoid charges. The case file grew thicker with reports, but thinner with promise. By the time January arrived, the search had effectively failed. Emily Hart was gone, and there was no trail to follow. The official investigation remained open, but with no leads, it slipped quietly into the category that every family dreads: a cold case. And yet, the unanswered questions refused to fade. Why had the dog lost her trail so quickly? Who was in the sedan that appeared near the bus stop at the exact time she disappeared? Why had no one seen or heard more on a street that seemed, in retrospect, so exposed? These questions lingered in silence, pressing down on both investigators and Emily's loved ones. The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. And as the long winter closed around the town, the haunting reality set in. Despite hundreds of people searching rivers, forests, and abandoned buildings, Emily Hart had left behind not a single trace. It would be this vacuum, this gaping absence of evidence, that allowed her case to stagnate for nearly 2 decades, until a discovery deep underground would change everything. As weeks passed with no trace of Emily Hart, investigators began shifting their attention from wide searches of the landscape to the narrower circle of people who might have known her. The case had reached a point where hope of finding her alive was fading, and the reality of abduction seemed unavoidable. With no physical evidence to guide them, suspicion became the primary tool. Detectives built a list of names, not of strangers, but of men who had occupied quiet corners of Emily's life. Each one was questioned, scrutinized, and in the absence of proof, left in a haze of uncertainty that would linger for years. The first name to surface was that of Professor Daniel Reeves, a middle-aged psychology instructor who had taught Emily for 2 semesters. Colleagues remembered her visiting his office frequently, often staying long after other students had left. Friends described her as confiding in him about personal struggles, particularly stress over grades and anxiety about her future. For investigators, the connection seemed too close to ignore. When Reeves was brought in for questioning, he appeared cooperative but defensive. He admitted to mentoring Emily, but denied any inappropriate relationship. He claimed he had been at home the night she vanished, preparing for a lecture. Detectives pressed for details, but he had no one to corroborate his alibi. He lived alone, and his timeline was unverified. Rumors spread quickly. Students whispered about late-night meetings, about the professor's reputation for giving certain students unusual attention. On campus, speculation painted him as manipulative, someone who might have blurred the lines between mentorship and obsession. Yet when investigators searched his office and home, they found nothing. No diaries, no hidden photos, no evidence of contact beyond the ordinary. Reeves was unsettling to some, suspicious to others, but there was no proof tying him to Emily's disappearance. He walked free, but the shadow of doubt never fully left him. The second figure under scrutiny was closer to Emily's personal life, her ex-boyfriend, Jason Miller. Their relationship had ended 6 months before she went missing, and by all accounts it had been a rocky breakup. Friends remembered heated arguments, accusations of jealousy, and Emily's decision to cut ties after repeated attempts by Jason to reconcile. When detectives knocked on his door, Jason admitted the relationship had been difficult, but insisted he had moved on. He claimed he had been with friends the night Emily vanished, watching a basketball game at a local bar. That alibi, however, quickly showed cracks. When questioned, the friends gave inconsistent accounts. Some remembered him arriving late, others were unsure whether he stayed the entire night. Surveillance footage from the bar showed Jason entering, but the timestamp was later than he had told police. Detectives zeroed in, suspecting he could have intercepted Emily at the bus stop before joining his friends. Jason denied it firmly, insisting the breakup had been final and that he bore Emily no ill will. Yet his short temper during questioning, his history of arguments with her, and the holes in his alibi left detectives uneasy. Still, without concrete evidence, they had no basis to hold him longer. He, too, walked away. The third and most haunting figure remained faceless, the unidentified driver of the blurred sedan captured near the bus stop. Investigators treated the vehicle as a critical lead, scouring registration databases for dark sedans in the area. They pulled over similar cars, questioned drivers, and even asked the public to report neighbors or acquaintances who matched the description. Nothing stuck. The footage was too poor to narrow it down. The car, and whoever drove it, became a ghost in the case file, a presence suspected of knowing the truth, but one the police could never touch. As these three threads unraveled, the investigation slipped deeper into a fog of uncertainty. Each man denied involvement, each had circumstances that made them plausible, yet none could be tied definitively to the night Emily vanished. The absence of forensic evidence was crushing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of struggle. Every suspect interrogation ended with the same conclusion: suspicion without resolution. The media, restless for answers, filled the gaps with speculation. Local news stations ran features on Emily, portraying her alternately as the bright, disciplined student with a promising future and as a troubled young woman who might have hidden secrets. Reporters questioned her relationships, her mental health, even her own choices in the days before she disappeared. The narrative fractured, creating two Emilys in the public eye: the innocent victim and the mysterious enigma. For her family, these portrayals were unbearable. They watched their daughter's image twisted to fit headlines, reduced to sound bites that ignored the person they knew. Emily was neither a perfect angel nor a troubled cipher. She was simply their daughter, reliable and present, someone who would not have left without a word. Her parents begged the public to see her as human, to remember that behind the speculation was a young woman whose life had been interrupted. The lack of progress fueled obsession among strangers. Online forums lit up with theories, some pointing to the professor, others to the ex-boyfriend, still others to the nameless driver of the sedan. Amateur investigators dissected timelines, analyzed rumors, and traded suspicions as though piecing together a puzzle. But like the professionals, they hit dead ends. No matter how the pieces were rearranged, none fit with certainty. As months turned into years, suspicion calcified into myth. Reeves carried the weight of whispers, Jason lived under the cloud of his broken alibi, and the phantom driver remained an enduring question mark. The investigation had painted three shadows around Emily's disappearance, but could illuminate none of them fully. By the end of that year, the police had no choice but to scale back their efforts. With no evidence to prosecute, no confession to pursue, and no body to examine, the case slipped further into paralysis. The suspects returned to their lives, yet none were ever entirely free. For Emily's family, it was torture. Knowing that answers might lie with one of these men, but lacking proof, meant the truth remained locked away, just beyond reach. And as the investigation faltered, so too did hope. What had begun as an urgent search now drifted toward silence, and in that silence, a darker reality loomed. Emily Hart's case was no longer a matter of if she had been harmed, but of when the truth would finally emerge, if it ever would. By the time the new decade began, Emily Hart's case had slipped quietly from urgency to memory. What had once dominated headlines and nightly broadcasts was now revisited only on anniversaries, the story retold in condensed form. A bright student, a bus stop, a vanishing, and the enduring question of what had happened in those missing minutes. For police, the foodie file became just another cold case stacked among hundreds. For her parents, every day remained the same unbearable weight. Inside the Hart home, Emily's room was frozen in time. Her textbooks, once full of highlighted notes, sat untouched on her desk. The quilt her grandmother had sewn lay folded at the end of her bed, waiting for a return that never came. Her mother dusted the dresser weekly, adjusting framed photos with hands that trembled more as the years went on. The space became less a bedroom and more a shrine, a stubborn refusal to accept that Emily would never again walk through the door. Reporters still called on occasion. Each November, they asked the same questions: how the family was coping, whether police had shared anything new, what Emily had been like. Her parents obliged, their voices carrying hope thinner each year. On camera, her father's words grew sharper, filled with frustration at the lack of progress. Her mother's voice wavered as she repeated the same plea, that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. These annual stories were meant to keep her name alive, but for the family, they were salt in an unhealed wound. While official leads dried up, the case found new life in the corners of the internet. Online forums and true crime communities dissected Emily's disappearance in obsessive detail. Users reconstructed her last known steps, debated the blurred sedan, speculated about her ex-boyfriend, her professor, even strangers who might have crossed her path. Some theories leaned toward serial offenders who had targeted college students in the region. Others claimed she had been trafficked across state lines. A small but vocal group insisted she had staged her disappearance, pointing to her weird text as evidence of a plan. For those who never knew her, Emily was no longer a person but a puzzle to solve. The Hart family occasionally saw these theories, sometimes shared by acquaintances or unavoidable during searches online. Her mother admitted that she would scroll late into the night, reading strangers dissect her daughter's life like evidence in a trial. Some comments were cruel, others far-fetched, but the most painful were the ones that made her wonder if there had been some overlooked truth in Emily's behavior. It was a cycle of grief and doubt, one she could never fully escape. Her father refused to engage, describing the forums as vultures feeding on tragedy. But he, too, could not stop wondering if buried among the noise was a piece of the truth police had missed. The detectives who had led the original investigation eventually retired, handing over thick boxes of files to new officers who inherited a backlog of unsolved cases. Each new detective reviewed Emily's file with diligence, but with no evidence, no tips, and no body, there was little they could do. They revisited old suspects briefly, checked in on leads that had long gone stale, and closed the folder again. Officially, the case remained open. In practice, it gathered dust. For the Hart family, the years blurred together. Holidays passed with an empty chair at the table. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Friends tried to comfort them, but the sympathy of neighbors faded as time stretched on. New families moved into town who had never heard Emily's name. College students enrolled and graduated, unaware of the girl who had once walked the same paths and never made it home. By the mid-2000s, Emily was one of thousands of faces cataloged in national missing person databases. Her photograph appeared on websites and in binders kept by non-profit organizations. To strangers, she was just another face on a wall of the lost, her story reduced to a few lines in a grainy picture. For her parents, she was still everything. The gap she left in their lives never narrowed, and each year without answers pressed heavier on them than the last. The silence became its own kind of cruelty. There was no resolution, no grave to visit, no evidence to suggest what had happened or why. Hope was stretched thin but never fully gone. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call carried the possibility of news. More often than not, it was only disappointment. By 2017, the 20th anniversary of Emily's birth, her mother admitted she no longer knew whether to pray for her daughter to be alive or simply for her to be found. The distinction weighed on her heavily. Her father's grief hardened into anger, directed at a system that seemed to move on while they remained trapped in the past. He attended city meetings, reminding officials of Emily's name, insisting the case not be forgotten. His persistence kept her story alive in small ways, but it also reminded him daily of the futility of waiting. As the decade closed, it seemed that Emily's case might remain unsolved forever. The town had grown quieter about her, the police had grown weary of repeating the same updates, and the family had been forced into a routine of grieving without resolution. Emily Hart had become not only a daughter lost, but a symbol of how time can bury even the deepest wounds in silence. What no one knew was that beneath the surface of Brookdale, hidden behind sealed bricks and forgotten passages, the answers had been waiting all along. In the spring of 2024, nearly 19 years after Emily Hart vanished, Brookdale was no longer the same quiet town it had been. Businesses had changed, faces had come and gone, and the bus stop where she was last seen had been rebuilt twice over. For many, her name had become a distant memory, a cold case spoken of only when anniversaries rolled around. But all of that changed on an overcast morning in May, when a crew of construction workers were sent to repair drainage lines near the edge of town. Their assignment seemed routine: stabilize old storm channels that ran beneath an abandoned stretch of railway. It was a sight no one thought twice about, a place long forgotten except by graffiti artists and the occasional drifter. The workers had been clearing debris when one of them noticed an unusual hollow beneath the tunnel wall. A small section had collapsed, exposing bricks that looked older than the rest. As they dug further, the hollow widened into what appeared to be a sealed passage, hidden behind decades of dirt and stone. At first, they assumed it was just part of the original drainage system, a forgotten service corridor. But the smell hit them almost immediately: damp, metallic, and wrong. When one of the men shined a flashlight inside, the beam caught the twisted frame of a bicycle, half rusted and crumpled against the wall. Scattered across the dirt floor were scraps of fabric, faded to gray but unmistakably clothing, and farther back, tangled among debris, lay the outline of bones, human remains partially buried, partially exposed. The workers froze, their chatter silenced in an instant. Within minutes, the site was evacuated, and police were called. By midday, the tunnel was swarming with investigators. Yellow tape sealed the entrance, squad cars blocked off nearby streets, and news of the discovery spread faster than officials could contain it. Forensic teams in protective suits entered the hollow carefully, photographing every inch. What they found was more disturbing than anyone had expected. The passage, about 15 feet long, seemed to have been deliberately sealed decades ago. Inside were not only skeletal remains, but personal items: shoes, fragments of purses, a set of keys fused together with rust. Everything suggested that the site was more than an accident, more than a person lost and forgotten. At first, no one dared say it aloud, but everyone thought the same thing. Could this be where Emily Hart had been all along? The town buzzed with morbid curiosity. Social media erupted with speculation, locals gathering near the barricades despite police urging them to stay away. Some swore they remembered hearing rumors about the tunnel back in the early days of Emily's case, though no official search had ever extended that far. Others whispered about predators using the tunnels as a hunting ground, a place where the vulnerable could vanish without a trace. The possibility that multiple victims might be buried there only deepened the sense of dread. For the Hart family, the phone call came quickly. 19 years of silence shattered in an instant. Detectives informed them cautiously that human remains had been found, that personal effects were being cataloged, and that testing would be needed to confirm identities. It was not a confirmation, but it was enough to reopen old wounds they had spent nearly 2 decades trying to endure. For them, the tunnel was both a horrifying possibility and the only hope left of finally knowing the truth. Inside the sealed chamber, investigators worked slowly, removing each item with care. Among the debris were articles of women's clothing, some too degraded to identify, others still intact enough to hint at their original form. The bicycle, rusted beyond repair, looked like it had been abandoned in haste, and the bones, partial, scattered, some crushed by the collapse, told a story of violence that had yet to be pieced together. Forensic anthropologists began their work documenting trauma, estimating ages, and preparing DNA analysis. Within hours, rumors spread that one item stood out from the rest: a small silver pendant, tarnished but still legible, engraved with initials. Though officials refused to confirm, whispers claimed the letters matched Emily's. The possibility electrified the community. For nearly 2 decades, her disappearance had been the town's darkest mystery. To think that her final resting place might have been just beneath their feet all along was almost unbearable. Police treated the site as a potential burial ground. They expanded their perimeter, searching adjacent sections of the tunnel, probing for more sealed cavities. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who had sealed the passage? How long had the remains been there? And if this was Emily, why had no one connected her case to the tunnels in the years since? By evening, national media outlets had descended on Brookdale. Satellite trucks lined the streets, reporters broadcasting live updates about the tunnel discovery. Some framed it as the possible resolution to Emily Hart's case, while others speculated it could expose a string of crimes stretching back decades. The town, once again, found itself under a microscope, reliving the nightmare it thought had faded into history. Inside police headquarters, detectives pored over old files with renewed urgency. Maps of the area were re-examined, old suspects' names re-entered into conversation. For 19 years, the investigation had stalled. Now, with the discovery in the tunnel, everything was back on the table. But beneath the surge of activity lay a deeper, more chilling thought. If the tunnel held not only Emily, but others, what they had found was not simply the resolution of a single missing person case. It might be the unearthing of something much larger, something hidden in plain sight, waiting nearly 2 decades to be exposed. And as night fell over the sealed-off tunnel, one question echoed through the community, haunting and unresolved. Had Brookdale been living above a graveyard of secrets all this time? The tunnel was silent except for the measured sounds of forensic teams working methodically in the dirt. Every inch of the sealed chamber had to be documented, photographed, and cataloged before a single item could be removed. What appeared at first glance to be a grim discovery soon revealed itself as something far more unsettling. The skeletal remains were fragile, fractured by years of pressure, but among them lay items that told pieces of a story. A shoe still bearing its sole, a rusted zipper from a jacket, and, most striking of all, a silver pendant engraved with 2 simple letters, E.H. The pendant was bagged and labeled like everything else, but the initials cast a heavy shadow across the team. There were thousands of possibilities, but in Brookdale there was only one that mattered. The possibility that it belonged to Emily Hart transformed the atmosphere instantly. What had been a disturbing find became potentially the end of a 19-year nightmare. Still, no one dared make the claim aloud. The protocol demanded patience. The remains were carefully removed, bone by bone, laid out on a sterile surface where anthropologists could begin their analysis. Early observations pointed to a young adult female, consistent with Emily's age at the time of her disappearance, but it was the damage that caught their attention. A fracture to the skull, distinct and forceful, suggested blunt force trauma. This was not an accidental fall, not someone who wandered into the tunnel and never came out. It was violent. Samples were rushed to a laboratory for DNA testing, For the Hart family, the waiting was unbearable. 19 years of uncertainty had conditioned them to silence, to disappointment, to hope withheld. And yet, this time felt different. The pendant, the age, the location, it all aligned too closely. When the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA matched. The remains in the tunnel belonged to Emily Hart. The confirmation made headlines nationwide. After nearly 2 decades, the missing student was no longer missing. For her parents, it was the answer they had begged for, but it was not peace. The reality of her death, the violence implied by the skull fracture, opened a deeper wound. They had asked for truth, but the truth was unbearable. Their daughter had not simply vanished, she had been murdered. For police, the discovery meant more than closure. It meant the case was suddenly alive again. Files that had sat dormant in archives were reopened, suspects reconsidered. Detectives who had worked the case years earlier were interviewed for their recollections. The professor, the ex-boyfriend, the driver of the mysterious sedan, all names that had once floated in suspicion were pushed back into the spotlight. Whoever had placed Emily in that tunnel had concealed her well enough to evade capture for 19 years. Now, investigators were determined to uncover what they had missed. But as excavation continued deeper into the chamber, the narrative shifted again. The initial assumption had been that the sealed passage contained a single victim. Yet more bones emerged, some overlapping, some buried at different levels. A femur inconsistent with Emily's frame, a smaller set of vertebrae, teeth that did not belong to her. Soon it became undeniable. There were multiple victims in the tunnel. The implications were chilling. What had seemed like the resolution of one case was instead the doorway to something larger. If Emily had been murdered and hidden here, she was not the only one. Someone had used the tunnel as a dumping ground, a place to conceal more than one life. Forensic teams began working in shifts, expanding their excavation. Each day brought new fragments, new personal items, hints of lives ended and forgotten. The town's reaction shifted from morbid curiosity to outright fear. People whispered not only about Emily, but about the possibility of a serial offender who had stalked the community for years. Old unsolved disappearances from neighboring towns were revisited. Families who had lived with their own unanswered questions called police, asking if their missing daughters might be among those found in the tunnel. What had begun as Emily's case had widened into something far darker, touching wounds across the region. For investigators, the challenge doubled. They now had to identify multiple victims, determine timelines, and consider whether a single individual was responsible, or whether the tunnel had been a hiding place used by more than one predator over decades. The case grew heavier, layered with new complexities. And yet, through all of it, Emily remained at the center. Her pendant, her DNA, her fractured skull, proof that after 19 years, her family finally had an answer, even if justice was still far away. Her parents attended a press conference, standing before cameras with tears in their eyes. Her mother's voice broke as she thanked those who had never given up, while her father demanded that authorities find the person who had done this. The grief was raw, but behind it was anger. Whoever had taken Emily had walked free all these years, living while she lay hidden underground. Detectives redoubled their efforts. The ex-boyfriend's shaky alibi was reviewed again, as was the professor's solitary night at home. The blurred sedan from the footage was revisited, enhanced with modern technology in hopes of pulling out details missed before. Forensic advances meant that old evidence could now be tested in ways impossible in 2006. The investigation was no longer just about Emily's disappearance. It was about uncovering whether a predator had been operating undetected, leaving behind victims that no one had connected until now. The discovery in the tunnel had begun as a shocking find. It became a forensic awakening, a brutal reminder that silence does not mean safety, and time does not erase truth. And as investigators stared at the growing number of bones emerging from the soil, one thought pressed heavier than all the rest. Emily Hart was finally found, but she was not alone. The discovery of Emily Hart's remains had already shaken the community to its core, But as investigators turned their focus from the victim to the environment that had concealed her, an even darker picture began to emerge. The rail tunnel where she was found was not simply an abandoned structure. It was a place with a long and complicated past, one that suggested her presence there may not have been a coincidence at all. Historical records revealed that the tunnel had first been dug nearly a century earlier, during Prohibition, when smugglers used it to move alcohol unseen beneath the town. After repeal, it was abandoned, falling into disrepair, but its reputation lingered. In the 1970s, teenagers used it as a place to drink and hide from parents. In the 1980s, homeless encampments formed in its shadows, where makeshift bedding and fire pits still left traces on the walls. By the 1990s, police reports began to describe it as a magnet for trouble. Drug deals, assaults, and whispered stories about predators who knew the tunnel offered seclusion few dared to enter. That history weighed heavily on investigators as they studied the sealed side chamber. It was clear the passage had not collapsed naturally. The bricks had been carefully stacked, the entrance hidden with soil and debris in a way that suggested intention. Whoever sealed the chamber had wanted it concealed, and they had succeeded for decades. The question was whether it had been the work of a single killer trying to bury his crimes, or if the tunnel had served as a shared dumping ground known to more than one person. Detectives began combing through missing persons files, not only in Brookdale, but in surrounding towns. The skeletal remains unearthed alongside Emily's did not belong to her, and DNA testing would take months, possibly years. To expedite the process, investigators looked for cases that matched the demographics suggested by the bones. Young women, missing between the 1980s and early 2000s, never recovered, their disappearances unexplained. Dozens of names emerged, each one a haunting reminder of families still waiting for answers. The community reeled as the scope widened. What had begun as a tragic resolution to Emily's case was transforming into a possible serial pattern stretching back decades. The possibility that predators had used the tunnel as a hunting ground was no longer theory but a chilling likelihood. Retired officers were interviewed about old cases. Some recalled whispers about girls who vanished without leads. Others admitted they had always suspected that Brookdale's location, isolated enough to hide movement but close to highways for quick escapes, made it an ideal ground for opportunistic offenders. Forensic teams studied the sealed chamber with meticulous care. The placement of the remains suggested they had not all been deposited at once. Layers of soil indicated different time periods, with some bones showing more weathering than others. One set of remains bore signs of trauma similar to Emily's, a fractured skull. Another showed evidence of defensive wounds on the arms, suggesting a struggle before death. The chamber was not a random accident site. It was deliberate, methodical, and deeply sinister. Theories began to circulate among detectives. One suggested that a single offender had discovered the tunnel decades earlier, using it as a private killing ground, sealing victims inside where no one would find them. Another argued that the chamber had been a known location among criminals, a place whispered about and passed between circles of predators. The truth was impossible to pin down, but the secrecy of the site made both options horrifyingly plausible. Public fear reignited. Parents who had been children during the years of Emily's disappearance now wondered if they had walked the same streets as a hidden killer. Families of missing girls from neighboring counties reached out to police daily, pleading for updates, hoping for closure. Some clung to the possibility that their daughters' remains might be identified, however painful, while others prayed not to see their names among the tunnel's victims. The FBI was brought in to assist, lending expertise in behavioral profiling. Analysts studied the possibility of a long-term offender who blended into the community, someone with access to the tunnels, strong enough to move bodies and calculating enough to hide them with precision. The profile described a predator who was organized, meticulous, and unrelenting. Yet, identifying a suspect from decades of possibilities was nearly impossible. Anyone who fit the description might now be elderly or dead. Investigators also considered the possibility that the tunnel itself had been the lure. Urban explorers and vulnerable runaways could have been drawn to it over the years. A predator might not have needed to hunt far if victims came willingly into the shadows. The notion was chilling, that the town's forgotten structure had been a silent accomplice in its own history of violence. As excavation continued, more personal items emerged: shards of jewelry, a torn handbag, a faded shoe with a child-sized tag. Each artifact told of another life ended, another story cut short. Detectives laid them out in sterile rooms, matching them to photographs from missing persons files, holding them up against decades-old reports from grieving families. Some items offered potential matches, others deepened the mystery further. For the Hart family, the revelation that Emily had not been alone in the tunnel was both devastating and strangely unifying. Their grief connected them to other families now pulled into the orbit of the investigation. Together, they demanded accountability, pressing police to admit the possibility that a serial killer had moved undetected through their community for years. The thought was unbearable, but ignoring it was worse. The tunnel was no longer just a crime scene. It was a monument to unanswered questions, a place where decades of silence had been stacked behind bricks and buried underground. And as the last of the debris was cleared, one reality became unavoidable. Finding Emily Hart had opened the door to a nightmare far larger than her case alone. When the sealed chamber beneath Brookdale was finally opened, it did more than confirm Emily Hart's fate. It forced investigators to re-examine every name that had once hovered on the edges of suspicion. Among them was Jason Miller, Emily's ex-boyfriend. He had been questioned in 2006, scrutinized for his temper and his shaky alibi, but without evidence, police had been forced to let him go. For years, his name lived only in rumor, a lingering suspicion whispered about but never proven. The tunnel discovery changed that. Employment records revealed that Jason had worked for the city's transit maintenance department during the very year Emily disappeared. His job had given him keys, access, and knowledge of the storm drains and rail tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the town. At the time, investigators had not connected him to those places. Now, with Emily's body found in one of them, the connection was impossible to ignore. Detectives tracked down old co-workers, men who had not thought about Jason in years. Their memories, though faded, carried disturbing details. Some recalled him taking tools into restricted areas without assignments. Others remembered his habit of lingering after hours, saying he had extra work to finish. One man admitted he always felt Jason seemed to know the tunnels too well, describing shortcuts and hidden corridors as if they were his personal territory. Back then, it sounded like bravado. Today, it sounded like a confession unspoken. Theories began to form. Jason could have intercepted Emily at the bus stop, coaxing her into his car under the pretense of talking. He might have driven her only a short distance before leading her into the tunnels he knew better than anyone else. The sealed chamber, carefully hidden, could have been his way of ensuring she would never be found. The blunt force trauma to her skull aligned with the violent temper friends had once described. It was a scenario that made sense, but the timeline carried its own cruel barrier. Jason Miller had died in 2018 from sudden cardiac arrest. He was just 34. Whatever secrets he may have carried died with him. Police could not question him, could not confront him with the evidence that had finally surfaced, could not test his story against the brutal truth of Emily's remains. The man who might have been the answer was now forever out of reach, and even if Jason had killed Emily, there remained the others. The additional bones in the tunnel spanned decades, some predating his employment, some possibly placed there after his death. It suggested that the chamber had not been the work of a single hand. Perhaps Jason had used it once, or more than once, but he may have been only one of many who had discovered its secrecy. That possibility was almost more chilling than the thought of a lone predator. It meant the tunnel itself had been a magnet for violence, a place passed quietly between those who knew its darkness. For Emily's family, hearing Jason's name again stirred, both vindication and torment. They had always suspected him, always feared his obsession might have been the spark that ended her life. But confirmation was impossible. Without a confession or forensic proof, the truth remained suspended just beyond reach. To them, it felt like losing her all over again, first to disappearance, then to time, and now to a suspect who could never face justice. The police admitted openly what had been whispered for years. They might never be able to prove who killed Emily, or how many others had met the same fate in the shadows beneath Brookdale. Jason Miller had become a ghost in the file, his presence undeniable, his guilt unproven, his secrets buried with him. And as the investigation stalled once again, the haunting truth remained that some answers would never surface, no matter how deep they dug. In the summer of 2024, Emily Hart was finally laid to rest. Her family gathered with friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed her case for years. 19 years of waiting had ended not with a reunion, but with a graveside service marked by silence and unanswered questions. The silver pendant recovered from the tunnel was placed in her casket, a symbol of the life she had been denied and the decades she had spent hidden in the dark. For the community, closure was elusive. The tunnel that had swallowed Emily was now permanently sealed, declared both a crime scene and a memorial. Flowers and photographs lined the barricades, candles burned at night, and messages from families of the other unidentified victims began to appear alongside Emily's. What had once been a forgotten structure was now a place of collective mourning, a reminder of how easily lives can vanish in plain sight. Authorities confirmed what the evidence made clear. Emily had been murdered, but beyond that, answers remained scarce. Jason Miller, the ex-boyfriend long suspected, was dead. Other leads were inconclusive, and the additional remains found in the chamber pointed to a broader, more complex history of violence that investigators admitted they might never fully unravel. The shocking truth settled over Brookdale like a weight no one could lift. For nearly 2 decades, Emily's body had been hidden beneath the very streets her friends and family had walked, beneath the town that had searched so desperately for her. She had not been lost in the wilderness, nor carried far away. She had been there all along, buried with others whose names may never be known. Sometimes, even when answers come, justice never follows.